In April 2026, the United States and Indonesia signed a defense partnership. Dry stuff on the surface. Cooperation, training, the usual. But running alongside it was a quieter conversation, a draft letter that would let American military aircraft fly more or less freely over Indonesian waters. Then you look at a map, and the dryness falls away. Indonesia runs along one shore of a narrow stretch of water called the Strait of Malacca, and more oil moves through that strait than through any other passage on Earth, about 23 million barrels a day, more than Hormuz, the one everyone worries about. Roughly a third of it, nearly 8 million barrels a day, is bound for a single country, China, which brings in around 80% of its imported oil through this one channel. So when Washington starts talking about who gets to fly over the Strait of Malacca, it isn't really about airspace. It's a hand resting near a valve that, if it ever closed, would reach straight into the Chinese economy. This is the Malacca Dilemma, and it's the strangest kind of weapon, i.e., one almost certainly never going to be used. That has rearranged how a great power sees the world anyway. Start with the place, because the geography is the whole story. The Strait of Malacca is a long, narrowing funnel of water between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra, with Singapore sitting at the southern mouth. It's the shortest sea route between the oil fields of the Middle East and the factories of East Asia, which is exactly why so much of the world's energy is squeezed through it. And it is squeezed. At its tightest, near Singapore, the navigable channel narrows to under 3 kilometers. More than 100,000 ships thread through it every year. So picture it less as a sea lane and more as a doorway, wide enough that traffic flows, narrow enough that in the wrong hands, it could be a door, one that closes. China didn't always have to care about this. For most of its modern history, it produced enough of its own oil. That ended in the 1990s, when its economy took off and its thirst for energy outran what it could pull from its own ground. From then on, China bought the difference abroad, and most of what it bought came by sea from the Gulf and from Africa, along that shortest route through Malacca. In 2003, China's leader at the time, Jintao, is said to have given the problem a name, the Malacca Dilemma. The phrase was an admission. A rising power had built its growth on fuel it had to import through a narrow passage it did not control, and that, somewhere on the other side of the world, the United States Navy did. Here's the mechanism, and it's simpler than it sounds. China's economy runs on imported oil. Most of that oil arrives on tankers. Most of those tankers have to pass through Malacca because the alternatives are longer and costlier. So the chain has one thin link, and everybody, in Beijing and in Washington, knows exactly where it is. In theory, you don't even need to sink anything to choke it. A blockade isn't the only tool. Insurers can refuse to cover ships heading into a war zone. Tankers can simply decide the risk isn't worth it. The strait doesn't have to be mined. It only has to feel dangerous. But, and this is the hinge of the whole story, being able to choke a choke point is not the same as being able to afford to. The same water carries oil to Japan, to South Korea, to Taiwan. Close it on China, and you close it on America's closest friends in Asia, and on the global economy with them. Put the numbers together, and the stakes get sharp. 23 million barrels a day through Malacca, about 29% of all the oil that moves by sea. The lion's share of the crude in those tankers comes from the Gulf, headed east, and China, the world's largest oil importer, takes the biggest single bite, nearly 8 million barrels a day, close to half of all the crude that crosses the strait. That dependence sat quietly for 20 years. In 2026, it stopped being quiet. After a crisis over the Strait of Hormuz earlier in the year, American strategic attention swung east to the next choke point, the bigger one. And then came the defense pact with Indonesia. And alongside it, talks on a letter that would open the skies over the strait to American military flights. None of it was framed as aimed at China. It didn't have to be. The map does the framing. A pact about who flies over one strait is the world saying out loud what the shipping charts have shown for 30 years. So could the United States actually do it? Close the door? Physically, yes, the US Navy and its partners could make the Strait of Malacca impassable, or at least uninsurable, faster than China could stop them. That's the raw fact under all the talk. The trouble is what comes next. Choking Malacca wouldn't just pressure China, it would tip Asia into a war nobody had chosen and a global recession nobody walks out of cleanly. Oil prices would spike everywhere, including in the United States. Allies who depend on the same water would be collateral. It is, in other words, a doomsday lever, the kind that mostly works by never being pulled. Which sets up the real argument. The hawks say the leverage is real, so use the threat of it. The skeptics say a threat you can't carry out without burning down your own house isn't leverage, it's a bluff. Both are partly right, and the gap between them is exactly where China has had to live for 20 years. The honest case against the panic deserves a fair hearing, because parts of it are clearly right. Start with the obvious. Closing Malacca is self-deterring for all the reasons we just covered. Beyond that, China has spent 2 decades making itself harder to choke. It built a strategic petroleum reserve to ride out a disruption. It laid overland pipelines through Myanmar, from Kazakhstan, from Russia. So some oil arrives without ever touching the strait. And tankers aren't actually trapped. They can reroute south through the Lombok and Sunda Straits, adding days and cost, not a wall. It's a serious argument, but notice what it concedes. The Myanmar pipeline, China's most direct bypass, is built to carry only around 400,000 barrels a day, against the nearly 8 million that still come through Malacca. The overland routes together cover well under a fifth of the need, and the alternate straits, they funnel right back into the same wider seas the US Navy patrols. The choke point isn't erased, it's just stretched a little wider. The easy version of this story writes itself. China imports most of its oil by sea, almost all of it through one narrow strait, and the US Navy sits across the top. Knife at the throat. Roll credits. We don't buy the easy version. It's true in the way that doesn't matter and wrong in the way that does. Closing Malacca isn't a policy, it's a catastrophe. China's name is on it, but so is everyone else's. So if the weapon can't really be used, here's the question worth sitting with. Why has China spent 20 years and a fortune behaving as if it could? The pipelines through Myanmar that carry a fraction of what the strait does. A navy that a generation ago barely left its own coast and now keeps watch across the Indian Ocean. Ports leased from Pakistan to the Bay of Bengal. Oil buried underground for the bad day. Nobody pays that bill to fix a problem they think is imaginary. That's the real shape of the Malacca Dilemma. It was never about the strait being closed. It's that a weakness you can't engineer away and your rival can't safely use still ends up writing your foreign policy for you. China is rebuilding itself around a door it will almost certainly never be locked out of, and every back exit it digs still opens onto water somebody else is watching. The pact, signed in April, didn't start any of this. It just switched the lights on. 3 plausible versions of the next decade, and the truth is probably a blend. 1, the bypass slowly works. China keeps laying pipe, stockpiling crude, and buying more oil from Russia overland. The strait never stops mattering, but it matters less, and the Malacca Dilemma fades from an emergency into a manageable cost of doing business. 2, the Navy closes the gap. China's fleet keeps growing until contesting a blockade in its own backyard becomes credible. The leverage doesn't vanish, it just gets too expensive for anyone to reach for. The valve stays open because closing it stops being cheap. 3, the dependence hardens. The bypasses stay too small, the reserve only buys months, and China stays hostage to a strait it can't escape, which makes every flashpoint from Taiwan to the South China Sea quietly about energy security too. The most likely future isn't any one of these, it's the race itself, China spending whatever it takes to loosen a grip that may never actually tighten. Go back to that signing room in April. 2 defense ministers, a handshake, a document thick with the kind of language meant to be skimmed. Nothing in it threatened anyone, it didn't have to. The threat was already there, drawn on every shipping chart for the last 30 years. It just needed someone to stand close to the valve for everyone to remember it was a valve. That's the thing about Malacca. The strait will almost certainly never be closed. Closing it costs too much, hurts too many, settles nothing. But almost certainly never isn't never, and a great power can't bet its future on a maybe. So China keeps building around a door that's still wide open, pipelines, reserves, a navy, a string of ports, paying every year to soften a blow that may never land. That's what a choke point really is. Not the place where the ships go down, the place you can't stop thinking about.